Are you looking for a podcast where you can hear from real people regarding their real dental drama? If so, then you've come to the right place. Join hosts Bethany Petty and Dr. Rena Kuba as we dive into the solutions we've created and the mistakes we've made while managing dental drama. Let's get started.
Happy New Year, everybody. I hope you guys are having a wonderful New Year's Day. I'm excited to jump into a topic that Dr. Kuba and I discussed in our last episode, the one that dropped right before Christmas. And we talked about the importance of planning your schedule for this 2024 year. And I made the comment to Dr. Kuba that you need to make sure to factor in time off, and that oftentimes we shoot ourselves short with time off. We just feel like we can't be away from the practice, or if we are away from the practice, that ultimately the production won't be there. We won't be able to make ends meet. And this podcast today is really breaking things down into how can you take the time that you need and still make the money that you need to make. So I'm going to go pretty granular here and try to give you as much detail as possible. It is New Year's Day. If you haven't started your 2024 planning, then today's the day, and I'm hoping that these tips will be very helpful as you start to plan out the calendar, and more importantly, as you plan out your time off or time away. Now, as Dr. Kuba and I mentioned in our last episode, I personally think it's incredibly important to keep yourself mentally and emotionally charged for your practice. So every person's level of time away is going to be different. There's going to be some people, like my dad, that needs a day or two off and then they're ready to go. And honestly, if you give them any more days than that, they get a little bit anxious or angry. And that's okay. Plan those 1 or 2 days off. Do you need that once a month? Do you need that every quarter? Do you only need that a couple times a year? You might be the person that you can't really decompress from work until you've been gone at least a couple days. And then you need a couple more days to recoup after that. So maybe you need to plan a 4 or 5 day vacation, and maybe you need several of those a year. Only you know what you need. And then there's plenty of you out there that are like, hey, I really need 2 weeks away from the practice, and I would be good if I just did that once a year, or I really need to do that twice a year. So first and foremost, you need to really evaluate yourself and think about what is truly recharging to you. I would want to make sure that if you were shutting down the practice and stepping away, that it's time well spent, and I wouldn't want it to be too short or too long, and therefore it's causing problems either way. So just take time to first and foremost think about the amount of time that you need away. Now, I've shared this example before, but I think now's the appropriate time. Sometimes you may not even necessarily need the time away, but you want to take the time away. I have a client that, again, took the opportunity last year, and he's doing it in full this coming year, to mark off every school holiday that his kids are out of school. He's closing down the practice and he will be off with them, and that his kids are getting older, and that was really important to him. So it's not necessarily that he needed the mental break, but he wanted to be there for his kids, and he just looked at the school calendar, and whenever they were closed, his practice was closed. Some of you may have different needs. If you've got a parent that you know is the one that watches your kids, and they take a 2-week vacation every July, you may already know, hey, I'm going to have childcare issues at that time. Let me go ahead and make that my time away as well. Just think through your needs, and it may not necessarily be I need to recharge, but it could also be just family life circumstances that you need to plan for. Once you've really determined the amount of time that you need away and why you need that amount of time away, don't do what most people do and go, oh, that's just not possible. I can't take that much time away. Prevent that thought from happening. Indulge me here just a little bit and follow me down this formula that I'm going to give you. And don't dismiss the idea that you can be away from your practice without doing this formula, because what I have found is the people that take a leap of faith and choose to do time away, their practice, I would say 99% of the time, does just as well, if not better, than when they were there all the time working. So first and foremost, you do really need to determine your production goal or your production need. This is, again, a perfect time of the year to do that. Many of my clients that I've talked with, we are establishing 2024 goals, and we're trying to figure out what do those goals need to be. Now, you may be in a position where you are perfectly satisfied with the production that you had in 2023. It paid the bills, it paid you well, gave you retirement investments, gave you some savings account, even allowed you to take a good vacation or two. If that's the case, then this section is really easy. You simply go, okay, last year my practice did $1 million in production and collection. That was enough. I'd like to do the exact same thing again. Some of you may go, hey, I did $1 million in production and collection last year, but I actually paid myself $2,000 less per month than I really need to pay myself. And so then you look at that goal, you go $1 million plus the $2,000 that I need per month means that my new goal for 2024 is going to be $1,024,000. So that is the first step, is determining your production need. I want to give you a few additional tips here of what you can do if you don't know what your production needs to be. Number one, first and foremost, you need to think about what your monthly pay needs to be. So as the practice owner, or even as an associate, because many associates can take this same path and think through these numbers. So what does your monthly pay need to be? Now that may lead you down a path of, what am I paying for that I shouldn't be paying for? What is my actual need? And then what would I actually like to have to do these fun things, or to save a little bit more, or whatever the case may be. So what does your pay need to be? Start with that. What are your monthly practice bills? This should be relatively easy to access if you've got a good CPA. It's incredibly easy to access. It's called your profit and loss report. Or if you are attempting to do books on your own, then you would go into your software, that might be QuickBooks, and you would pull your monthly expenses. It's important that you look at this on an annual basis, because your monthly expenses are going to ebb and flow. There's going to be certain months that are higher in dental supplies, certain months that are lower. What you really want to do is look annually at that and go, okay, on average, I spend for the year $4,000 a month in dental supplies, because when I looked at it, the total was $48,000 for 2023. So I know I need to set aside $4,000 a month for dental supplies. Now, I would encourage you to factor in those miscellaneous things. So maybe there's several supplies that you use and are really committed to, and they've been on the rise. And so you don't want to factor in that lower number. You may actually want to build in a little bit of fluff for that particular category. So look at all of your practice bills. That's payroll, that's rent, that's electricity/utilities, that's your dental supplies, that's your random office supplies and paper and ink and all of that, toilet paper, paper towels, all of that should be pretty easy to access through your CPA, your bookkeeper, or through your software program. Then you need to think about, how much am I currently investing in retirement, or should I be putting in my retirement account? And then you need to factor that in as well. So my pay is this, my retirement amount is this, my practice monthly bills are whatever amount, and then how much are you saving each month. So that's not retirement. That's a separate category where you're putting funds away for a rainy day. And you need to factor that in as well. Once you've looked at those categories, your pay, your practice bills, your retirement, and your savings, then I would really advise you to take one additional step, which is, as you look ahead, are there any expenses this coming year that you know are coming that were not in last year's bills? Like maybe your car is on its last leg and you know you're about to have to buy a new car. And so when you thought about your pay, you forgot to factor in, depending upon the car that you're going to get or how nice it's going to be, you forgot to factor in that $700, $800, $900, $1,200 a month, however much cars cost now. You forgot to factor that in. So you need to go back to your pay and actually elevate it up to include that anticipated expense. Same thing with your practice. Maybe you've been on a loan program with the ITERO. You've been lending their equipment and you started that in December, and it's a 6-month low lease payment, and you know that it's actually going to flip over in May to being the full loan payment. Okay, factor that in and allow that to adjust your production need for the year. Okay, so that's step one, is determine your production goal or need. Based on that, you want to then go back and look at last year, 2023, and look at your production for the year. So just like you looked at your expenses, I want you to go back and go, okay, last year we produced and collected $1 million. But now let me take that down a step further. Let me look at January. What was my production? Let me look at February, March, April, so on and so forth. Essentially, you want to be able to identify the trends of last year. What were your heavy hitter months? What were your dismal months? And it all ended up adding up to $1 million, but the monthly production may have varied pretty significantly, and you need to know that. So I would just write those numbers down for each month of 2023. Now, this again, if you know something weird happened, you had to have a surgery in May, and so the production, you had to have a temp doctor in there and your production was cut in half. Okay, well then that's not truly a trend that we need to bank on in 2024. Or you had a baby and you were out for 3 months and you had a temp doctor in and your production was substantially lower. Okay, we're not going to bank on that. So if you've got those anomaly months, go back to the 2022 year and look at that month for that year. And then know that it's probably going to be closer to that dollar amount. You also need to factor in anything that occurred in your practice that was some type of special or incentive. Like I've got multiple clients that will do an Invisalign special. So you may look back at, I don't know, June, and you are like, oh my gosh, what happened? We did $200,000 in June, and all the other months were, $80,000. Okay, well, if you did a special on Invisalign and you got some really good participation in that, then in June, then that was your anomaly month, and we can't factor that in for 2024 unless you're going to be doing that same special and you anticipate getting the same results. All this to say, you need to go back and look at what your trends were. Then you need to turn that into a projection for 2024. So if you are not raising your fees, if you are not doing anything differently, you're just hitting repeat again for 2024, you can look at each of those monthly numbers and assume that you're probably going to make about the same. You're going to produce or collect about the same amount. And you put that in as a projection, and that should lead you up to the exact same, or pretty close to the exact same annual amount for this year. Now, if you need higher, then you need to factor that in. So let's say that you're like, my practice produced and collected $1 million, but I really really need to produce and collect 1.1 million this year due to my pay isn't where it needs to be. Okay, well, that's a 10% increase that you need to factor in. So you would go to January and you look back at January's numbers of 2023 and you're like, oh, okay, we produced and collected 90,000 in January. Okay, but you need 1.1. So you would raise January 10%. Instead of going for 90,000, you're going for 99,000 in January. You look at February. Oh, February was tough. We only produced and collected 70,000 in February. Okay, you need 10% more. So you would be aiming for, in 2024, 77,000. Whatever increase amount you need to factor that in a projection format for each month of 2024. Now, I will say, be cautious on your goals and your projections. You don't want to shoot yourself in the foot and go, oh, if 1 million was great, then 1.5 million would be even better. Not so much, because that is you would be producing a third more in your practice, and that's really unsustainable growth. So unless you're doing something remarkably different in 2024, incorporating something new technology that you can charge out for and you're able to capitalize on that, or you're bringing in an associate and you know that they'll be producing, or you're bringing in an additional hygienist who can produce, then you can artificially inflate those numbers higher. But if it's just going to be you, yourself, and you, and it's going to be the exact same formula for 2024, then I would say 10% is probably as high as you want to aim for growth, unless you do something different. So you put those projections in for 2024, and put it in for January, February, March, April, May, etc. And then that should all add up to your projected growth. Let's say it was 10% or 1.1 million in this particular case. Now you know for the year what you need to achieve. 1.1 million, and then you know the monthly amount that you need to achieve. Now, all of a sudden, we've got these time off goals, right? So let's say that you're one of these people that you're like, you know what? I haven't taken off any time for the last few years. I'm going to take off 3 separate weeks this year. I'm going to go on 3 different vacations. That's wonderful. I applaud you. You need to do it. Now, what I would recommend is planning those out in a way that makes sense. So first of all, the easiest times to take off is when your practice is slower or historically lower in production. I know that seems odd because you're like, oh gosh, I can't take off in February because I'm already low. Yes, but you're low in February for a reason. For whatever reason in your particular practice, patients don't want to come in the month of February, or maybe you guys have so much gusto in January that you burn yourself out and then you're dragging your feet into February. You can speculate on all the reasons why, but for whatever reason, your practice is showing a slower February. That might be a great time to take a week off. And what we do for that is one of 2 things. You're like, oh, well, Bethany, we just decided that I needed to actually produce 77,000 in February to hit my $1.1 million goal. If I'm off a week, there's no way that I'm going to be able to do that. So what I say is there's 1 or 2 things you can do. Number 1, you can intend for the other 3 weeks of the month in February to ramp up your daily goals on those weeks to hit the 77,000. That's an option. The other option is, which by the way, you may be thinking, well, that's ridiculous. That won't happen. If February is slow for you, my guess is you could take off a week in February without missing a beat. Because probably if you look at your schedule, there's a ton of spotty days that weren't full and didn't have the production that they needed to have or the patients that they needed to have. And if you just eliminate a week and cram them into that 3-week period of time, my guess is you'd be pretty surprised that you're able to hit the same production. But let's say that makes you nervous. The other option is to bring that projected goal back down for February and go, you know what? Okay, instead of aiming for 77, I am actually going to aim for 67. I'm going to take $10,000 off. If I'm going to be off for a week, I'm going to assume that we'll come away with $10,000 less than I projected. Great. Now you've got $10,000 and you need to figure out where that is going to be spread up throughout the year. So let's say January is your kickback month. You've already raised the goal in your mind for January to $99,000. Maybe we take $2 of that $10,000 and we put it in January. And maybe March is really strong for you. So we take $2 from that $10,000 that we need to make up and we put it in March. And then we take $2 and we put it in May, which is a really great month. You get the idea. You take the $10,000 and you sprinkle it in where you think it could go based on your strong months. That is the other option. Now, one thing that a lot of my clients will do, depending upon the way that the calendar falls, is they'll try to minimize the monthly impact. And let's say they're taking a week off. They may take 2 days at the end of January and 2 days at the beginning of February. So that January is then only short by 2 days and February is then only short by 2 days. That's a good option as well. All that to say, you figure out which months that you need to take your break in. Let's say it's February, and then you're going to take another one in the July 4th week because your practice schedule always falls apart then. So February, July 4th, and then you know what? You're going to take the whole week of Thanksgiving off because even though that's busy, you want to be off with your family at that time. Fantastic. Figure it out based on your preference, and then you take your projections and you manipulate the numbers to come up with what you think is attainable. Now, let's say for January, we'll continue with this same example. Last year, you were at 90,000, but you need to be 10% higher. So now you're at 99,000. By the time you took off all the other weeks from the year, you added another 4,000 to January. So now you're sitting at 103,000 that you're aiming for. It's important for the team to know from a daily standpoint what you're aiming for. So let's say we're aiming for 103,000, and let's say that you work 20 days in the month of January, which is oftentimes possible because it is a longer month. So you normally work 20 days. You're going to stick with those 20 days this year in 2024. You take that $103,000. I'm going to round down for easy math because I'm doing this in my head as we speak. You take that $10,000 and you divide it amongst the 20 days, which means that you're going to need to produce $5,000 and some change each day in the month of January. This is the most critical step because so often we fail to achieve our monthly goals because we aren't really adding up the dominoes. We are looking at the month and we're like, oh man, we're only scheduled at 80,000. I don't know what to do. We got to get to 103. Oh, what should we do? What should we do? Should we call people? No. Your team needs to know every day needs to be $5,000. Well, what if we're short one day? Let's say Monday we were $4,000. You know what? The rest of this week, that $4,000 is being divided. That $1,000 that we were missing is being divided up among the remaining 3 days. So that's going to be $333 that are added to Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So it's constantly monitoring the days to make sure that we're hitting the targets that we ultimately need to hit. Now, sometimes clients will ask me, oh, if I take off a week, I should probably add some days somewhere else. No, that defeats the purpose because that means, let's say you decided to take off in February and you normally work a 4-day work week. And in January, you're like, oh, I'm going to be taking off next month. I'm just going to add 2 or 3 Fridays to make up for that. You are going to be coming into February so much more exhausted. If you are accustomed to working a 4-day week, just because you decide to take off 3 weeks throughout the year does not mean that you need to make up those days elsewhere. You should be able to, by discussion with the team, making sure they know the goals, making sure they know strategies to hit those goals, making sure that they're looking ahead to schedule accordingly to the goal. Your team and you should be able to work together to hit those goals without adding additional time for you to be in the office. So please don't use that as your only alternative. Think through the production needs that you have. Think through your strategy. Work with your team on strategies that they think will help hit the daily goal. And then simply take those numbers, break them up into the number of days that you're working, and that's your daily goal. If you get behind, you have to get ahead on another day. Now, again, one of the things that I want to encourage you guys on here is that even if it sounds unattainable, I can promise you it's way more attainable than you think it's going to be. What I have found is that when we have a really clear goal, when we have shared that goal with other people, like our team, when we have put the time in to figure out a strategy for meeting that goal, even if it's just the daily goal, that oftentimes that focus ends up getting us what we want, which is ultimately the goal. So I think it is perfectly possible to take any amount of time off of work if you have done the math to figure out what you truly need. You have worked with your team on figuring out the strategy for overachieving in your solid months, and then ultimately breaking it down into a daily focus that is discussed often with your team members, and that when you guys miss the mark, you are coming together and going, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again, and how can we recover from that so that we get back on track for the month? I do think that team communication, collaboration, and training is an important factor in all of this. So you need to take time. You don't just assume that your team knows how to go from a $4,500 day that they were used to in 2023 to a $5,000 day that they are not used to in 2024. You're going to have to work with them and figure out, what are we going to do to hit this? Is this a couple extra hygiene appointments a day? Okay, great. The math makes sense on that. How can we get a couple extra hygiene patients in? Or how can we schedule the hygienist differently so that she's more productive? What if we got better at adding in same-day preventative treatment like sealants or fluoride? Is there any type of special that we need to run for something like sealants or fluoride, or products that we have that we could potentially sell? So get your team really chewing on what they could do to be creative. Production growth, in my mind, is a lot of little things that add up to the growth that you need. And really, when you think about it, this example that we just talked about, 10%. We're just aiming for 10% more. And oftentimes that 10% is just packed in your schedule with potential. It could be a wife that's coming that has never brought her husband, and we had a hygiene open up tomorrow, and we're calling and inviting that husband in. It could be as simple as adding little extra things. Maybe we haven't done a good job of talking about night guards, but we know so many of our patients could benefit from night guards. So maybe we're just focusing on night guards, and that's it. And that's enough to kind of push us into that 10% growth category. One other thing to keep in mind is when you look ahead at 2024, just like we talked about when thinking about your expenses, if you do anticipate adding an additional team member who is not a provider, so an RDA or a business assistant, if you plan to add that in 2024, you need to make sure to factor that into your expense side of things. Maybe you're not planning to hire that person until the fall, but ultimately that will take a part of your pay or a part of your overhead expenses, and therefore you'll need to kind of naturally ramp up when you bring that team member on. Let's say she's making $3,000 a month, then you would need to increase your goal from what it is for those fall months up $3,000 to pay for that person. The other thing to consider is staff raises that you might be anticipating. If you know that every August is when you meet with team members and extend compensation increases, then you need to anticipate what you plan to increase them to so that you can factor that into your budget as well. Let's say that you anticipate a total of $1,000 more per month in staff raises or compensation starting in August. Then go ahead and take that August projection and add $1,000 to it. One other thing that I want to note here on time away is that when you've done all of this math, let's assume that you're going from 2023 where you didn't take breaks and you are now factoring in the same production or even 10% more production for the 2024 year. It's important to consider that you also need to be able to pay your staff if you're taking more extended vacations. So certainly they may have PTO that they can be encouraged to use, but beyond that, if you're taking potentially 3 weeks off per year and you know that PTO will not cover those weeks off, I would strongly encourage you to consider that you are either upping their PTO time so that they have more to use, or you are allowing them to continue to work while you're gone, even part of the time, so that they can continue to earn. The math should be there so that ultimately you can keep producing like you always have, as if you were there full time. The only difference is now you're off for 3 weeks. So the production is still there, which should enable you to pay your team as you always have. So don't let this time away penalize your team members or encourage them to temp while you're gone, thus giving you a whole new headache, which is your team members finding another place that they can work where their hours aren't reduced with all of these vacations. I hope this has helped. I want to kind of remind you of the key things that you need to do here. First of all, think about yourself. What do you need to stay rejuvenated and recharged and refreshed this year? What kind of time off do you need? And that could be as simple as a day every month. That could be a week off every quarter. Only you know yourself, but figure out what that goal is. And then you determine your production need based on your expenses, your pay, the practice bills, your retirement, and savings. What do you need the production and collection to be? Then you need to go back and look at 2023 to figure out your projections for 2024. What did January of 2023 look like? Okay, what can we project that it's going to look like in 2024? And what does it need to be based on those needs that we talked about in the second step? The final step is putting in your time off, strategizing that a little bit, and then using that time off to then retroactively impact what your goal needs to be for that month, breaking it all the way down to the daily goal. And then talking with your team, making sure they understand the goal, making sure that they know strategies to accomplish that goal. Don't just tell them the goal and hope that they do it on their own. Give them the tools and the resources that they need to get the job done for you. Okay, that has consumed our time today. I do hope you'll take it seriously. Mental health and emotional health in the dental field has always been a problem, and it is especially a problem in the wake of the pandemic. So I just want to strongly encourage you to take care of yourself. And that usually means time away, the ability to recharge. Factor that into your schedule for 2024 and then mathematically figure out how you can make that time off happen without having to add in extra days or reduce your ultimate goal in the way of production and collection. I wish you the very best, and once again, happy 2024 to you.
Thanks for joining the conversation today. We hope that you are comforted in knowing that you are not alone, but we also hope that you're walking away with some really great tips and tricks to try in your practice. We value your feedback, so please take a few moments to rate and review the podcast. Finally, We want to make sure that we're covering the topics that matter to you. So track us down on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and let us know what topics you want us to cover. As always, please know that we are rooting for you today as you manage your dental drama.